Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this evening on our Q&A. I want to first thank Film North for their support and participation in co-presenting this discussion. I want to also thank O Cinema. I want to thank Magnolia Films for their generous support. I also want to thank John S. and James L. Knight Foundation for their support. We are ready to go into a film called I'm Not Your Negro. It is about James Baldwin by Raoul Peck. We have several films that are going to be going on throughout this series for the next 3 nights, Sunday nights specifically, and then Monday nights for the conversation. I want to introduce somebody that I've known for a long time that I really feel is an incredible part of not just the Minnesota scene, but he is a professor, he is a writer, he is a distinguished activist. He's been around for a period of time discussing issues that are very close to the issues that James Baldwin addresses in this. I want to introduce you to Dr. John Wright, who is with us right now this evening. So welcome, Dr. John.
Greg, I'm very glad to be here and glad that this webinar is being hosted and a chance for us to talk with a broad audience about a film of enormous import and accomplishment cinematically.
Thank you. I think, for us is, this is all very new, doing these things sort of online here. Zoom conference, you and I have usually done this together live, and so I know getting up to speed here was not as much of a pleasure for you, but I want to thank you for doing this. This film, I'm Not Your Negro, is really very important for me. I'm somebody who studied James Baldwin. I've read all his books. There's several books that if people are not aware of his work is Go Tell It on the Mountain, which was one of his first novels. The Fire Next Time, which is actually kind of a prediction of where we are right now in this country. If Bill Street Could Talk, which was also an incredible film that was out recently. And then there's a film that I find is really connected to what we're getting ready to talk about today, which is films and music. He has a book called The Devil Finds Work. And that's kind of when I want to start talking about that, because in the film, he was very influenced by films. And can we discuss that a little bit before we get into the more specific things about the context of the film?
Absolutely. There are, of course, a long list of written works by James Baldwin. Again, he was not only one of the finest, if not the finest American essayist of the 20th century, but again, a novelist, a playwright, and one of the most eloquent and powerful orators of our era. So there are a wide array of fronts. He was also a formidable film critic. And the title that you allude to, The Devil Finds Work, is a collection of Baldwin's essays on films. And his insights, again, are consistently both incisive and powerful. And the range of films he discusses in that collection, again, is indeed quite broad. He does, of course, have a primary concern with the relationship of African Americans to American history and culture, and the images, the portrayals, the types and stereotypes of African American character in American film. But he has a broader and deeper concern with, indeed, the place of cinema in modern life, amongst other things. So Baldwin engages us on many, many levels simultaneously.
One of the things that for the film that came out to me specifically is that in my life, I was during the 50s and 60s, I was enrolled in an all-white grade school and high school. I was the only black in the whole school in both of those. And I learned very similar to where he did, is not to hate white people or to dislike white people. I saw to take them each as individual people. And I think that he had a very similar background, even though he was clearly understanding that he was black and the issues that were there for him. I want to talk a little bit about what I never could quite understand, and I think he had the same problem, is what is it that causes this type of hatred towards black people who have not done anything directly to white people, and where is the seeds of that coming from in this country today?
Well, one of Baldwin's other accomplishments is that his essays on precisely the matter that you're raising here help developed the field that we now call whiteness studies. And he built on several generations of commentary by African American thinkers, scholars, artists, and activists about the nature of whiteness as a social and psychological phenomenon. And Baldwin brought to that subject not only his writer's instincts and rhetorical powers and so forth, but also his deep immersion in religious psychology and theology. We sometimes forget about James Baldwin, and to some extent, this film does not emphasize it, but Baldwin grew up in the African American Pentecostal church in its early years. And he was, again, his stepfather was a minister in the Temple of the Fire Baptized. Again, early Harlem-based Pentecostal enterprise. And Baldwin became a kind of child prodigy boy preacher, teaching the Testaments, Old and New, and using it again to probe the possibilities for the American future and the salvation and redemption, both of the souls of the congregations to whom he preached as a boy preacher, but also the larger society. So again, Baldwin brought an array of tools into this enterprise, and the understanding of hate and love, and the traditional Christian virtues, again, of faith, hope, and love. And I think it's not by, there's no accident that this film in part begins and ends with Baldwin talking about the matter of hope and optimism. He doesn't use the word faith very often, but again, the psychology of hope, the psychology of hate and love are central to his writing and his thinking, and again, his roots in the religious world.
One of the things that it discusses is that white people might, as the more we talk about race, more black people talk about race and use the sort of the generic term white people, they find it uncomfortable. They're going to find it difficult to come to for whatever reason, either guilt or embarrassment or whatever is they're feeling. But it's necessary for us now to confront the issues in order for us to save the nation, as kind of he says in this film, is that the history of America is the history of black people in this country. I find that really very interesting because it is basically true. If we really want to live the American dream, which is what we've fought for and lived for, is there's a reason America's got to come to it. And we are coming to that point in time right now, I think, probably more powerfully than we probably did in the 60s, but in a different way because it seems more multicultural, more multiracial. I want to just discuss that a little bit if we can, because I'm a child of the 60s as you are, and we saw the riots and we saw the protests and we saw the marches, but I think something's different now in this world that we're going into right now. And I wonder if this is true, that for what he said, that this may be what we need to do is to go here to save the country.
Well, certainly the question about the links between the past and the present and how we meditate and act on it. And Baldwin is very clear, again, in this film, that we are our past. And the difficulties that American society has had perennially with coming to terms with its past, of course, have powerful impacts on us that are both conscious and unconscious. And the kind of psychological perspective that Baldwin brings to those issues, like I say, on the one hand, is theological, but it's also existential. And while, again, the film does not try to identify or pigeonhole Baldwin's own position in this regard, he called himself a secular existentialist. And in that sense, saw himself linked again to the outlook of both Richard Wright, who was a kind of a father figure for him, who led him to Paris in that sense, and Ralph Ellison, the three of them, who were black male writers in the middle of the 20th century, all of whom had powerful religious upbringings, but had different impacts on each of them, but who defined themselves ultimately as secular existentialists. So it's the existentialist emphasis on individual choice, on the extent to which we define ourselves by the choices we make and the values we adopt in our own lives, as opposed to those things that are imposed on us institutionally, that Baldwin returns to routinely in his discussions about hate and love and social practices and so on. So there's this existential dimension to his thinking, both psychologically and philosophically, that we do need to bear in mind in terms of understanding how to place him and his perspectives.
There's a question by Ruben. His question is really about code switching and how does authentic black or male or black female identity intersect or assimilate into a dominant colonial structure under an anti-racist paradigm?
Code switching, of course, which is originally a linguist's term, having to do again with the movement back and forth between so-called standard American English and the dialects or vernaculars of other parts of the American population. Of course, that's a long-standing tradition in African American life. But people perhaps don't pay enough attention to the way in which a figure like Martin Luther King, who figures so centrally here in this film and to whom James Baldwin was so powerfully attached, Martin Luther King routinely code switched in terms of the kinds of audience he was addressing and the kind of language, rhetorical style that he used. It's part of the African-American sermonic and oratorical tradition, developing the rhetorical flexibility to move from one world of reference and language and metaphor and imagery to the other, and to do so seamlessly. Part of Baldwin's power is to do precisely that.
Do you think that most black people, on a certain level, learn how to do this or do this?
Oh, it's not a skill that's peculiar to African Americans. Mm-hmm. All groups who have been marginalized or pushed into outsider status in here have had to negotiate between the language of the controlling elites in the society and their own community modes of communicating and expressing themselves. So code switching is not something that's peculiar to African Americans, but we have made a high art of it. Right. And the African American vernacular that's expressed so powerfully in African American popular culture and slang and language and music and so on is part of that process. And it's a part, of course, of our mastery, again, of this bicultural interface that's been so powerful in our approach to American life. Du Bois gave it a name at the beginning of the 20th century. It's part of the double consciousness. It's also, again, moving from one world to the other.
Part of it's our survival mechanisms. I mean, it's that we wear the mask that, we
wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts, we smile. Why should the world think otherwise? So on. The psychology of the wearing of the mask.
Mm-hmm. I have another question here. Is what would Baldwin have to say about the current protests and the calls to change that are going on right now today?
Well, Baldwin, of course, because he was born in the middle of the 1920s in Harlem and came of age during the Depression and was a young man when the Harlem riots of 1935, which were indeed one way of defining the end of the Harlem Renaissance, was part of his childhood experience, as was the massive riots of 1943 in the midst of the Second World War. So for James Baldwin, the riots of the 1960s are basically a third major cycle in the course of his own personal experience in life. So I think we can say, in terms of comments he made about these earlier cycles of urban disorders, of rebellions on his own life, that this would be a source both of despair on his part on one hand and optimism on the other when he looks at what's different about this current cycle.
I give another question here that I can relate to is this person finds it very difficult to love this country. I mean, because of its history and I think this is not uncommon to a lot of Black people. I mean, this desire that we need to love this country even though they abuse us, I think is hard for us, because my ancestors, as far as your ancestors, have been here most of the several decades, several centuries. How do you think Baldwin, and did he address this issue about still loving this country even though it does it to you?
Well, that's a recurring theme, both in his essays, his speeches, and in his novels. And I think in this, he shares with Ralph Ellison a profound awareness of the ambivalence of African-American life, psychologically and culturally. W.B. Du Bois, again, whose work Baldwin knew very, very well, made it very clear earlier in the century that there are no more eloquent articulators of American democratic ideals than African Americans. That was one of the gifts of Black folk to the larger society that Du Bois emphasized in a book of that title in the 1920s, a gift of democracy that exceeded what the so-called founding fathers could imagine, a vision of democracy, of which we became the most intense and passionate keepers. That, on the other hand, of course, this long travail, the long tragic travail of 2.5 centuries of slavery and following another 1.5 centuries of Jim Crow and disfranchisement and marginalization, all those things that are at the opposite pole psychologically and experientially, and how you hold these things together leads to life on a tightrope, or as Baldwin's friend Ralph Ellison put it in the wake of the Harlem riots of 1943, as he reviewed the Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal's book, An American Dilemma, which was a major attempt in social science to come to terms with the American race problems, that we lived lives on the horns of the white man's dilemma. We had to learn how to create a life on the horns of the white man's dilemma.
I also have a question here that it said they saw Baldwin as standing aside, not aligning fully with any of the 3 M's, Martin, Malcolm, and Medgar, but presenting sort of a heterogenic Black male. If you agree, what do you make of his strategy to fight the stereotypes of the monolithic reduction?
All right, Craig, I had a little difficulty catching the latter part of your question there.
Yeah, what she's asking is if you agree with what Baldwin was doing early on, what do you make of this strategy in fighting stereotypes of monolithic reduction?
Well, again, the issue of dehumanizing through categorizing and stereotyping. This is a recurring theme for Baldwin. It's, of course, like I say, it's a major part of that collection of essays, The Devil Finds Work. The ways in which stereotyping and typing people of various groups and social categories is a way of counterposing, on the one hand, certain kind of reality-based experiences in the larger world with which one has difficulty coping, and the world of fantasy and make-believe. And to the extent that film, of course, the dream factory, the Hollywood dream factory, in a sense becomes a means through which we create public dreams that try to merge the worlds of fantasy on the one hand and reality on the other in different kinds of combustible mixes. Baldwin was very, very eloquent about that role. Again, in the film, he likens the one side of American entertainment and what the Hollywood Dream Factory produces as creating something that's very hard to differentiate from drug addiction.
Yeah, that was a good point that he brought out. There's the kind of, they need this kind of fantasy. Do you think this is connected to what are white people missing in their private selves that, they control, or their obsession in this response about the fear and the desire and the jealousy about Black people in this country. I mean, there's something there. I mean, I don't know what it is, and he doesn't answer it correctly either, because it's, I mean, I think that some white people think that Black people, if they get control, they're going to just go crazy and just kill them all, you know, but that's never been proven. Most Black people have never done anything to any white person to justify the abuse that they've received over the century.
Well, again, part of what, again, he in the film says about this is that the responses of whites to Blacks in American society has also often been through the psychological terms of terror, of fear, whereas African Americans have largely responded through to the larger society and the attitudes of whites, or through the need to survive. And those are in many ways quite different motivations, points of reference motivationally.
Yeah. So is it the fear or the terror that you say, because he did use that word in the movie, the terror? Where does the terror come from? I think this is what most Black people have never, or maybe even white people don't understand. Yeah. Where does the terror come from?
There's a wonderful story. Again, Baldwin was also a masterful short story writer. And a collection of his short stories called Going to Meet the Man has a really powerful, indeed it's the title story there, about, it's told largely through from the vantage point of a young white boy who is part of this experience with his father of conducting a lynching. And the psychology of lynching and its links to both the social and sexual fears is part of where Baldwin takes us there. Where Baldwin takes us. Baldwin was influenced, as were his close friends, both Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison, by the insights that Sigmund Freud brought to the relationship between social structure and sexuality, both repressed sexuality, right, and sometimes grotesquely expressed sexuality, and the ways in which attitudes towards African Americans were tied up in this morass of sexual feeling. It's there from the beginning in American society, as Baldwin also knew very well. It's there in Thomas Jefferson. All one has to do is to read Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, which is the most expansive writing he did about the nature of American society, and to see his attitudes about African American slaves, right? One of whom, of course, he fathered children, and the tangle of sexual feelings, and also the notion somehow that Africans were indeed related to gorillas and chimpanzees and so on. All these things become a recurring part of the American, both conscious and subconscious. So it's there again in Jefferson. It's there in King Kong in the 30s. And Baldwin's comments on films like that, again, ring powerfully true today.
In Toni Morrison's writings, Playing in the Dark, she describes how Black communities saw the white man as the terror, as the monster who was brutal and fierce. You know, it's kind of that. Baldwin talks about that same thing: is that there's white people have turned into moral monsters in this process. They've had to sort of destroy or eliminate or control Black people. And I think it's an interesting concept: is that they become the monsters that they fear, almost to a certain extent. Yes. Yeah.
There, I mentioned Ralph Ellison's their review, or in the 1943 of the Gunnar Myrdal study, An American Dilemma. And here's where there's an interesting nuanced difference between James Baldwin's outlook and that of Richard Wright. Ellison worked closer to the kind of reading that Gunnar Myrdal offered. And rather than talking about Americans as moral monsters, he talked about them as ethical schizophrenics, caught between the ideals of social democracy on the one hand, and of course the social practices, the conquest of the land, the dispossession and near genocide of Native Americans, and of course the enslavement continuing oppression and suppression of African Americans. So again, Baldwin could work and did indeed work that both sides of that divide. Ellison emphasized perhaps more this ethical schizophrenia than Baldwin did.
I mean, I think that I grew up with a family from Missouri, and they as a child, you're convinced, or you're not convinced, you are trained, taught to understand the brutality that white people can do to you. I mean, I can't remember a time in my life I did not see a picture of a hanging, a lynching. I don't remember that. From as young as I can remember, that was something the parents let us know, my grandparents let us know, this is the possibility as you go out into the world. That type of training, that type of understanding, and not to say that you don't come out with hate, you come out there with a protection process, So you're there trying to basically function in this world and still do your best in the world, which is you're constantly under this pressure. Baldwin talks about something that I thought was really poignant, was that Black people never can rest in this country. They can't ever find their peace in this country.
Well, Walter Mosley, another very powerful, of course, contemporary writer, novelist, and essayist. The title of one of his more significant, but I think less well-publicized series of works that focuses on a central protagonist named Socrates Fortlow, who's a Black ex-con. But the key title, Always Outnumbered, Always Outgunned, all right, is part of what Walter Mosley uses to define the state of mind and attitude towards a larger society that someone like Socrates Fortlow, who is a kind of Black everyman, has to deal with day in and out. The notion you are always outnumbered and always outgunned.
And that attitude is tiring, as you know. It just gets to be tiring.
A state of unending stress.
Right, exactly.
Which, of course, is one of the contributors to those underlying physiological symptoms from which African Americans are currently suffering under the coronavirus epidemic. Mm-hmm. It leads to that kind of stress, leads to hypertension, to heart disease, to clinical psychological depression, and schizophrenia, to an array of physiological and psychological disorders.
Yeah. Wanted to talk, Stephan wanted to talk a little about any reflections on the context between the narration of the film from Baldwin's text read by Samuel Jackson and the film clips of his interviews and oratory, which Baldwin himself was actually speaking. It was definitely a different contrast. I think what they're going for here is that Samuel L. Jackson is a narrator. He's narrating the story process. I don't think he was trying to sort of emulate James Baldwin's contextual style as a speaker. I think it was a filmmaker choice, but it is interesting because Baldwin's specific in the way he was an orator. I mean, he was obviously studied and trained and did what he did. Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, I was actually very happy with Samuel Jackson's approach to narration here, which was in part to efface or to suppress his signature vocal style from his own films, all right, to modulate it so that his persona didn't intrude on Baldwin's words. And for those of the viewers here who, again, have access to the DVD of I'm Not Your Negro, there is a segment with Samuel Jackson talking about his approach to voicing Baldwin's words. But again, it's largely one that he acknowledges, and I, again, heartily approve of suppressing his distinctive and idiosyncratic style. Baldwin, like I say, was a spellbinding orator. And in those parts of the film where we, for instance, in the excerpts from the Cambridge debate with William F. Buckley, or in some of the others as well, we can see extemporaneously or not, Baldwin had a total command of the English language. cultivated again by his early immersion in books in the New York Public Library and the shepherding from the white school teacher who was such an important influence on him earlier on. All those things, again, helped shape him. And again, I was glad to see that Samuel Jackson's narration did not take away from Baldwin's own natural speaking voice and oratorical mastery.
Yeah, I think that Raoul Peck, the director, really, I thought he picked the right statements and the powerful statements that Baldwin could only deliver in Baldwin's way. And Samuel Jackson kind of gave you sort of the basic recipe for Baldwin's actions and his desires. And I thought it was a nice approach to it, as opposed to having Baldwin kind of take the whole thing, because he is such a studied speaker. So I think your point is true. One of the things that do you think that is a question that's come in, is that in this risk in this current situation that the whites focus solely on the police culture, fail to look inward to their own misbehaviors as a group?
The latter part of the question here didn't come across clearly.
Yeah, that's okay. So I'll read it to you again. Is there a risk in the current situation that whites focus solely on police culture and fail to look inward to our own behaviors? Obviously, this person's white.
Yes. Well, again, one of the things that's powerful about Baldwin's writing and speaking is his ability to move from the first person to the second person forms of address. And in that sense, to take himself into the minds and thoughts, again, of the larger society of the white world, and to move back and forth rhetorically that way. He's extraordinarily skilled at doing so. Part of the power of that is that indeed it forces the listeners, the readers who are not African Americans, to confront their own inner psyches, their own worlds, their values, their moral outlooks, their experiences, and the gaps between their ideals and their practices in ways that a straightforward rhetorical assault, a first person assault, might not. He can use we, speaking from the vantage point of the larger white world, and then move back to an I in his black vernacular or high rhetorical style at the same time. And this is in part, again, another dimension of code switching that African American writers like Baldwin have always had to master, is the problem of dealing with a divided audience and with different experiences and a complex set of relationships that are symbiotic on the one hand in terms of African Americans having created out of the most distressing signs of circumstances the most powerful forms of indigenous American culture, popular and otherwise, and to which not only other white Americans, but people from around the world have found profoundly eloquent and speaks to them. That on the one hand, and again, this, of course, and continually antagonized a set of relationships. Contemporary African-American cultural commentator, Greg Tate, has a wonderful book collection of essays called Everything But the Burden, which is directed precisely towards this complex of attitudes and outlooks and practices whereby African-American culture can be appropriated, beloved, imitated by the white world, to the exclusion of literally taking on the burden, the dark side of the experience out of which those creative artifacts, expressions have evolved.
One of the questions that Baldwin keeps asking is why does America or the American people need an other, the quote unquote the other? It's a classic question.
Well, that's again a theme. Of course, that's not exclusive to James Baldwin. It's a theme that Toni Morrison, you mentioned Playing in the Dark earlier on, has also dealt with to some extent as well. But we've had a number of cultural commentators from outside the African American community who have explored those issues very, very well. One of them from the mid 20th century, whose work Baldwin knew very well, was Leslie Fiedler, who wrote a trilogy of cultural commentaries on American literature and culture and life that began with a volume called Love and Death in the American novel, Love and Death in the American Novel, and ended with Waiting for the End. But in it, Leslie Fiedler brought the insights both of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud to bear on understanding American literature and the polarities, the patterns, for instance, in film and novels of white male protagonists and dark male others, whether they're Native American, Chingachgook in Alaska, the Mohegans, or Queequeg in Herman Melville's Moby Dick, or Sam Fathers in William Faulkner's tales, and so forth. The need for this kind of reconciliation between self and other in this distinctive pattern here again of what Fiedler called homoerotic, potentially homoerotic relationships between white males and dark others that weren't so much about sexuality, that was always latent, but about the need to reconcile at the level of moral and interpersonal relationships that, of course, had been scarred again by the history of conquest and dispossession and slavery that were so endemic to creating this society.
Somebody just brought up the question, the topic of the sexually wanting and fearing is what they fear in themselves.
So it was framed as a question or as
that
comment?
was a question, yeah. Sexuality, wanting and fearing is what they fear in themselves. That's a question, Okay. I know that Baldwin talks about that a little bit, and there's obviously in other writers too. Even Frances Wellsland, I think she talks about that.
There are not one of Baldwin's novels that addresses this issue, I think, in a very personal, highly dramatized personal arena, is Another Country, which deals very explicitly with a series of cross-racial as well as cross-sexual black-white couplings. And again, it works these themes out in significant detail. Again, his short stories and also plays, in which Baldwin probes those issues, I think, in great detail. For those of the viewers of this film who are interested in a psychological reading, a book published back in the early 1970s by the psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Joel Koval, White Racism, a Psychohistory, probes those issues in significant detail across the long historical arc.
One of the things that we kind of shift a little bit here to, one of the things that Baldwin, or not just Baldwin, but African Americans are really very dedicated to the creation of art and objects. And we talk about Baldwin as an artist, as a writer, along with Toni Morrison. When he left Paris for a specific reason, and the decision to leave Paris, I'm not sure if he needed to come back for himself. And I don't know if he came back to fight for Black people, but I think he needed to come back to experience kind of that connection. He talks about missing his family and stuff like that. Can we discuss that a little bit too? Because there is this family that first of all, he went to Paris because he wanted to be an artist, and that's really big. We can talk about that later. But coming back was for perhaps, and I might be wrong, different reasons other than just wanting to come back and get involved in civil rights.
Well, in that regard, we ought not see Baldwin's experience as idiosyncratic or without precedent in African American life, because the experience of expatriation, of voluntary self-exile, has a long history in African American life. It was part of the 19th century. Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown and a number of other African American abolitionists in the waning years of the antebellum era had literally to leave this country, particularly after 1850 and the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, or in the 1857, the Dred Scott decision. Leave this country, go to Europe. as a place of refuge, at least for a while, before returning. Baldwin is part of a later aspect of that same experience, but there was already a significant community of African-American expatriates in France, in Paris, that Baldwin was very well aware of, and most prominent of them, of course, was Richard Wright, who became a kind of father figure for him. But prior to Richard Wright's moving to Paris in 1947, there were generations of African-American musicians and painters who had done so also, to get free, at least for a moment. So they hoped, from the force of American racial oppression. The return to this country, in part, was an attempt to come to terms with those parts of himself that exile in Paris could not heal. And Baldwin, again, while the film doesn't emphasize this, again, some of Baldwin's earliest collections had to do precisely with the experience of exile, a feeling, a stranger in the village, one of those important essays, again, from Baldwin's early essay collections. Notes of a Native Son, when there, again, the native son is an explicit reference to Richard Wright and that world of the exiles in Paris that Baldwin left America to become part of. So again, he would continue to write about those, those particular kind of tensions later on, an extent to which his returning to this country, immersing himself into civil rights, into relationships with Martin King, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and many others, including, again, a figure perhaps in terms of this film who needs perhaps more attention, psychologist Kenneth Clark. It was Kenneth Clark who orchestrated those television interviews with Martin, with Malcolm, with Medgar, with James Baldwin, that formed the cinematic core of Raoul Peck's film. Kenneth Clark, he and his wife Mamie were the psychologists who did the famous doll studies that became the basis of the NAACP's litigations against segregation in 1952, and then, of course, in the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case in 1954, which basically detailed the psychological impact on African-American children of unspoken as well as practiced and spoken racism through the medium of dolls and their attitudes toward dolls. Kenneth Clark was that way. He was also, his relationships, again, with this cluster of Black male leaders had also led him to deeper and deeper engagement in the political and social struggles. He authored a very important book called The Dark Ghetto, which was the first place where the idea that African-American ghettos were in fact internal or domestic colonies in this country. Stokely Carmichael's analysis a year or two later, in part, was founded on Kenneth Clark's insights, psychological insights. And in that regard, Kenneth Clark has his own significance here, which ought not be, but he indeed provided a framework, a cinematic framework. Unfortunately, those interviews that Raoul Peck got access to have been housed in the Library of Congress and not been available to the public for all these years. So Raoul Peck is to be congratulated for making them available, at least excerpts of them now.
I think that, this film is, I think, very, very powerful film, and I think it shows the power of cinema. I mean, cinema can't ever cause a revolution, but it can enlighten people and inform people and get them to focus on a campaign, perhaps, that can actually move things forward. So I think this is I have a lot of respect for this filmmaker. I know that as we talk about arts as it relates to African Americans specifically, is very powerful. And James Baldwin is one of those things. But as a writer, are there Black writers or Black thinkers today that sort of are there to carry on sort of the work of Baldwin, like Coates and people like that? Is there anybody that you can reference?
Well, again, one of Baldwin's other dilemmas in life was how to reconcile his aspirations as an artist, all right? His aesthetic and expressive impulses on the one hand with the political demands on him. and the demands on African American writers and dancers and musicians and painters and so forth. He did not want to be reduced to being some species of race spokesman, and wanted to be regarded indeed as an artist. One of the sources of his initial critique of Richard Wright was that to some extent he believed that Wright had become captive to that enterprise, that he'd become the voice and the face of Black protest writing. And to that extent had, from Baldwin, a couple of his early essays, had succumbed to creating his own set of rigid stereotypes of black-fisted anger and rage. Baldwin wanted to do something different. And his first novel, his semi-autobiographical novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, tried to chart a different direction. And it's a powerfully rich read to these days. But part of what Baldwin found in the course of his career, later years, was that he was pulled inexorably closer to Richard Wright's position over the course of the next 3 decades after his initial autobiographical novel. In that sense, he became more like Richard Wright in many respects as he grew older and matured as an artist, and had to work out a new kind of rapprochement between the aesthetic and the political forces in his life.
I mean, yes, I think he less fiction-based and more reality-based his writing became. This is a question. What would Baldwin say? What would Baldwin say should be the role of a first-generation American of color in the struggle for equality? Which I think is an interesting question, because you and I are now living in a city, in a world that there are people coming that look like us that are coming to this country now.
So again, the question was what would
Baldwin
Black folks
say?
Who are first generation
Mm-hmm.
in this country, specifically who've immigrated from Africa or elsewhere in the African world?
Yeah, or India.
Raoul Peck offers us one answer to that. Again, he's a Haitian American immigrant who grew up in Brooklyn in dire circumstances, and who found through Baldwin's work and Baldwin's work on him as a teenager, part of his way to voicing his own sense of self and social commitment. This again, the place of West Indians and African Americans, and African immigrants in American life has been important from the outset, although we perhaps don't pay sufficient attention to it. You don't have to be born in America to have had the elements of the experience of African America. We're seeing that, of course, not right at the moment, in these responses from around the globe of African people scattered literally around the globe, and of peoples not of African descent, but who have been the objects, the subjects of imperial conquest and dislocation and oppression in a multitude of forms, and who are finding now, again, through, of course, the horror of what happened to George Floyd, a context for expressing their own desires for full citizenship and human rights in this postmodern, new millennial world that we occupy.
And I think that where we are right now is I believe that's sort of a crossroads of really an opportunity for America to be what America, I think, was designed to, the Great American Experiment. I think it can be that if we accomplish what you're saying, is where everybody can start to really examine how can we be not different races, but the human race, and support that. One of the things that I think that also comes out in this work is, is racism is in this country is so powerful that there can be some type of pessimism about ever changing this. I just had this conversation with somebody today. It seems like there's so much racism, equality, all those things. But we invented racism, or racism was invented. I shouldn't say we did. Racism was invented, so thus it should be able to be destroyed, correct? But does the mountain seem so high that we can't climate?
Well, I think it's important to bring that into the discussion here, because of course so much of the reaction to George Floyd's death has been about hope for the future. What are our hopes for the future? On what grounds, and indeed, can we have hopes for the future, as opposed to pessimism about it? One of the things that perhaps the viewers here may not know, but there's a whole strain of contemporary African American thinking about precisely these issues that's rooted not in hope, but in pessimism. And it's called Afro-pessimism, and it has roots in Minneapolis here. One of the leaders of this enterprise is Frank Wilderson III, who is the son of Frank Wilderson II, who was Dean of the College of Education and Vice President at the University of Minnesota. Frank Wilderson III immersed himself in the Black Power and civil rights struggles, not only in this country, but abroad. He became part of the African National Congress in South Africa and went through the entire process of seeing South African apartheid come to an end and what has followed it. Part of his experience, all right, has been to become increasingly pessimistic about this, or to articulate an Afro-pessimism as a kind of a combination of a new kind of existentialist, African-American Black existentialism that's rooted in a historical consciousness that sees racial oppression and the legacy of slavery as so deeply rooted in American society and in global society that it is incapable of reform, of reforming itself, and can only be eradicated through revolutionary action.
One question here that came in is that basically there's one terrifying existential question for whites that Baldwin has historically posed: is who would they be without the fictitious or fictional Negro, nigger that they have created today? What do you feel Baldwin would encourage whites to start to answer that question?
Yeah. I mentioned earlier, Baldwin's role in helping stimulate the academic discipline of whiteness studies here in recent decades. There is a wonderful collection of essays that was put together by Dave Roediger, who was taught in American Studies department and history department here at the university some years ago. And it's a collection called On Being White. And essays by Baldwin there, along with the Du Bois and Toni Morrison and many others as well. But precisely the issue that this viewer has raised now is addressed in some of those collected essays in On Being White. So again, I heartily recommend that to be added to reading lists, again, for those who are moved by this film and want to deepen their own understanding.
Is there a book by Baldwin that about Baldwin, a biography that you could recommend for some people? I've gotten several people out. So.
Well, now, of course, there's a growing shelf of biographies of James Baldwin that readers can turn to, and I don't know that I would point to any single one of them. There is a marvelous documentary biography of Baldwin called The Price of the Ticket that I heartily recommend, and devotes significant attention again to his years abroad in exile, but tracking his entire life. And it's to be read in conjunction with a collection of his own works, his essays and short stories, called also Price of the Ticket. So putting Baldwin's written works and Price of the Ticket alongside the documentary biography, film biography, Price of the Ticket, would be a good place to go to get a full sense again of the arc of his career and personal life.
I got one final question here. I think would be a good way to wrap this up. Is this person's asking? I found a very compelling Baldwin statement that Africans Americans embody an evolved model and an ideal of democracy, more evolved than the founding fathers. I think you implied that. Your thoughts about that?
Well, that's a restatement of the argument that W.E.B. Du Bois, I alluded to earlier on, that Du Bois made back in the 1920s. One of the gifts of African Americans to this country, again, is a broader, more expansive vision of democratic idealism than the founding fathers, most of whom were slaveholders, could articulate. So I think that's a reword of what now is a not new idea, but an idea that needs to be understood in its most fulsome way.
I want to thank you for being here, John. I think that I want to thank you for being a part of this conversation. Hope it was good food for thought for the audience out there. I want to thank, again, our partners in this, Film North, for their involvement. I want to thank O Cinema. I would like to thank the the Knight Foundation and Magnolia for their involvement in this. We also have 3 more films coming. Check the mspfilm.org website for additional programming so that we can continue to have an audience coming to these films and we can carry on these discussions. Again, thank John. I really want to thank you for this, and I think it was an inspiring conversation. And thank you.
Well, I thank you very much, Craig, and I thank the viewers for turning in here. If I have one time for one final recommendation here, it has to explore, for viewers to explore in more detail, James Baldwin's relationship with Lorraine Hansberry, which is part of the film here, but was a deep emotional engagement for him, and one that our local theater professor and playwright Calvin Wilkes explored in some detail in a marvelous play that was mounted at the Pillsbury House Theater this past year called Jimmy and Lorraine. And Lorraine Hansberry, again, herself, they were parts of the same writers groups in New York and Harlem, and had a number of important points of connection. And again, I heartily recommend to viewers to explore that connection in more detail.
So thank you for that, and please join us. Who Streets is June 14th. Toni Morrison is June 21st. Please reserve. You can go on right now and reserve your Who Street reservations, which is a film about sort of Ferguson and the formation of the conflict down there and the protests. And obviously Toni Morrison is Toni Morrison. It's a great documentary. Thank you very much and good night.